Hello everyone, and welcome to Creepy Comfort. I know many of you use these videos to sleep, so before you slip into dreams, let me know where you're listening from in the comments below. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now get comfortable and relax, and let's begin. I've always loved the woods. Something about the solitude, the quiet rustle of leaves in the wind, and the way the light filters through the canopy overhead felt like an escape from the chaos of everyday life. But now, I can't set foot near a tree line without my chest tightening and my palms breaking into a cold sweat. It started with an impromptu weekend hiking trip. I'd been under a lot of stress. Work deadlines, a breakup, the usual chaos that leaves you yearning for an escape. So, when my friend Marcus suggested we hit the trails for some much-needed solitude, I jumped at the chance. The forest we chose was tucked far away from any major town, a sprawling wilderness that promised untouched beauty, the kind of place where cell service died, and you were left alone with your thoughts and the unyielding vastness of nature. From the moment we arrived, something felt off. It wasn't the forest itself. On the surface, it was beautiful. Tall pines stretching into the sky, moss-covered rocks, and a babbling creek that snaked alongside the trail. But the air carried a strange stillness, like the forest was holding its breath. Birds chirped faintly in the distance, but closer to us, there was only silence. "I swear it's like nature's on mute," Marcus joked, but his laugh felt forced. We hiked for hours, following the trail markers deeper into the woods. The further we went, the more I felt an inexplicable sense of unease. It wasn't just the quiet. The woods seemed wrong. Trees grew at strange angles, some bending unnaturally toward the ground. The bark was scarred with patterns that didn't seem random. Spirals, crosses, and lines that almost looked deliberate, as though someone had etched them there. By late afternoon, we reached a clearing. A dilapidated wooden cabin stood at its center, leaning precariously to one side. "This wasn't on the map," Marcus muttered, pulling out his phone. The screen was blank, no service, no GPS. I wanted to turn back, but Marcus was curious. "Let's check it out," he said, already heading toward the cabin. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, creaking loudly as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick and stale, reeking of damp wood and decay. The floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, torn fabric, and what looked like animal bones. "Weird," Marcus whispered, picking up a faded photo from the floor. It was an old Polaroid, the kind you don't see anymore. A family stood in front of the cabin. A man, a woman, and two children. Their faces were blurred, but something about their posture was unsettling. They weren't smiling. "Let's go," I urged, but Marcus was already poking around. That's when I heard it. The sound of footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Marcus froze, nodding. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging along wood. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely think. "We're not alone," Marcus mouthed. Without speaking, we slipped out of the cabin and into the shadows of the trees. The clearing was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sun was sinking fast, casting long shadows across the forest floor. We hurried back toward the trail, but the woods had changed. The trees seemed closer together, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. The trail markers we'd followed so carefully were gone. "We're lost," Marcus muttered, panic creeping into his voice. Then came the sound again. Footsteps, this time accompanied by a low, guttural humming. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing moment. "Run," I whispered, grabbing Marcus's arm. We bolted through the trees, branches whipping at our faces and legs. The humming followed us, an eerie, melodic drone that didn't seem to come from any one direction. And then, ahead of us, a figure stepped into our path. They were tall and gaunt, their face hidden by a hooded cloak. In their hand, they held a lantern, its dim light casting flickering shadows across their features. "Where are you going?" the figure asked, their voice cold and hollow. I froze, my body refusing to move. Marcus grabbed my arm and yanked me backward, his voice trembling as he muttered, "We need to go," but the figure took a step closer, and another. The lantern's light grew brighter, illuminating their face. Except they didn't have one. Where their features should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin. We turned and ran, the figures humming echoing behind us. The woods seemed endless, the trees pressing in on all sides. Just when I thought we'd never escape, we burst into another clearing. The parking lot. Our car was still there, and we didn't waste a second. Marcus started the engine, and we tore down the dirt road, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. To this day, I don't know what we saw in those woods, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear that humming, and I swear it's getting closer. Our next tale takes us deeper into the unknown. Story 2. A year after that horrifying trip, I promised myself I'd never set foot in the woods again. But promises like that are hard to keep, especially when life has a way of cornering you into situations you'd rather avoid. This time, it wasn't my idea. My cousin Rachel was the adventurous type, always chasing the next thrill. When she invited me on a weekend getaway to celebrate her birthday, I thought we were headed for a cabin rental near a lake. Instead, she'd planned an off-the-grid camping experience in a stretch of forest known for its rugged trails and remote beauty. I didn't want to be the buzzkill who backed out at the last minute, so I forced a smile and packed my gear. The first day wasn't bad. The trail was well marked, and the forest was alive with the sounds of nature. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, the occasional scurry of small animals. Rachel was in her element, snapping photos and laughing as we hiked deeper into the woods. By late afternoon, we reached our campsite, a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. We pitched our tents, started a fire, and settled in for the evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest transformed. The cheerful noises of the day gave way to an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the distance. Rachel didn't seem to notice. She was busy roasting marshmallows and telling stories about her last big hike. I tried to relax, but the unease I'd felt during my last trip to the woods was creeping back. It started with the sound of snapping twigs. At first, I chalked it up to wildlife, but the sounds were deliberate, rhythmic, like footsteps. "You hear that?" I asked Rachel. She paused, listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. "Probably just a deer," she said, shrugging it off. But I wasn't so sure. The noises continued throughout the night, soft whispers of movement just beyond the firelight, the occasional rustle of leaves, and once, the faint sound of what I could have sworn was laughter. By morning, I was ready to pack up and leave, but Rachel insisted we press on, eager to explore the more remote trails. Reluctantly, I followed her deeper into the forest. The trail grew narrower and harder to follow, and the trees seemed taller, their branches weaving together to block out the sun. The air grew colder, the kind of chill that settled deep in your bones. That's when we found it. At first, it looked like an ordinary pile of rocks, the kind hikers use to mark trails. But as we got closer, I realized it wasn't random. The stones were arranged in a circle, and at the center was a small, crudely carved figure made of sticks and twine. "What the hell is that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Rachel knelt to get a closer look, her fingers brushing the edge of the figure. "Probably some kind of art project," she said, though she didn't sound convinced. "Let's keep moving," I urged, a sense of dread twisting in my stomach. The further we walked, the stranger things became. More of those stone circles appeared, each one more elaborate than the last. Some had sticks arranged in geometric patterns, others held animal bones, feathers, and scraps of fabric. And then there were the trees. The bark was scarred with deep, jagged cuts that formed symbols I couldn't begin to decipher. Some looked like runes, others like crude drawings of eyes, all staring down at us from the shadows. "I don't like this," I said, stopping in my tracks. Rachel was ahead of me, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. "What is it?" I asked, but she didn't respond. I followed her gaze and froze. Standing in the distance, partially obscured by the trees, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its skin pale and almost translucent in the dim light. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, and its arms hung limp at its sides. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then the figure took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. "Run," I whispered, grabbing Rachel's arm, but she wouldn't budge. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the figure as if in a trance. "Rachel," I hissed, shaking her. Finally, she snapped out of it, and we turned and bolted back the way we came. The forest seemed alive with sound. The rustle of leaves, the snapping of branches, and that same low humming I'd heard a year ago. We ran until our legs burned, tripping over roots and scrambling through underbrush. When we finally reached the campsite, we didn't stop. We grabbed our gear and kept running, desperate to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever was out there. By the time we made it back to the car, the sun was setting. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. "Did you see it?" Rachel whispered, her face pale. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the forest, watching us. I didn't tell Rachel. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped, that whatever we saw in the woods had followed us. And in the silence of my room, I thought I heard it again, the humming. Now, let us venture further. Story 3. A few months after my experience with Rachel, I swore off the woods for good. It wasn't just fear. It was the nagging sensation that the forest was alive. Not with animals, but with something far older and darker than I could understand. Still, life has a way of luring you back to the places you least want to go. This time, it was a work retreat. I worked in marketing, and our company had decided on a team-building experience in a secluded lodge deep in the mountains. The itinerary promised trust exercises, outdoor activities, and immersive nature walks. My protests were overruled, and soon enough, I found myself on a bus with 15 colleagues, heading into the heart of a wilderness I wanted nothing to do with. The lodge was picturesque, a sprawling wooden structure nestled in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. It had all the hallmarks of rustic charm: exposed beams, a roaring fireplace, and walls lined with taxidermy that seemed to watch your every move. The first day passed uneventfully. We had icebreaker games in the main hall, a group dinner, and a brief walk around the lodge's perimeter to acclimate to our surroundings. I stayed close to the group, my eyes darting to the tree line every few minutes. It wasn't until the second night that things began to unravel. We were split into smaller groups for a night hike, guided by a local ranger who seemed far too excited about his job. He was a wiry man in his late 40s, with a scruffy beard and a way of speaking that made you feel like everything was a joke you weren't in on. "Stick close," he said as we set out. "The forest here has a way of playing tricks on you if you're not careful." The trail was narrow, winding through the thick underbrush. The ranger led the way, his flashlight casting long shadows that danced across the trees. I hung back, walking near a colleague named Darren, who seemed just as uneasy as I was. "Not a fan of the woods?" he asked, his voice low. "Not anymore," I admitted. The air grew colder as we moved deeper into the forest. The trees pressed closer together, their gnarled branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots on the path and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. And then we heard it, a low, guttural growl, so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind if it weren't so deliberate. The group froze. The ranger turned, his face lit by the beam of his flashlight. "Probably just a coyote," he said, though his voice lacked its usual cheer. We continued on, but the atmosphere had shifted. The forest felt oppressive, the air thick and hard to breathe. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. We reached a small clearing, and the ranger paused to let us catch our breath. "This spot's got some history," he said, gesturing to the trees around us. "Legend has it this used to be sacred ground for the local tribes. They believed the forest was home to spirits, some good, some not so good. Folks around here still talk about strange sightings, hearing voices when no one's around. But that's just old stories." His words didn't comfort me. As we stood there, I noticed something odd. The trees on the edge of the clearing were marked with deep scratches, as if something large had clawed at them. The marks were too high to be from any ordinary animal, and they formed strange, almost deliberate patterns. "Do you see that?" I whispered to Darren. He nodded, his face pale. The growl came again, louder this time. It seemed to vibrate through the ground, sending a shiver up my spine. "What was that?" someone asked, their voice tinged with panic. The ranger held up a hand, signaling for silence. He scanned the tree line with his flashlight, but the beam seemed to get swallowed by the darkness. "All right, let's head back," he said, his tone clipped. We turned to retrace our steps, but the trail was gone. "What the hell?" the ranger muttered, spinning in place. The path we'd come down had vanished, replaced by an unbroken wall of trees. Panic rippled through the group. People started talking over each other, their voices rising. "Stay calm," the ranger said, though he didn't look calm himself. "We'll find our way back." We pressed on, cutting through the underbrush, but the forest seemed to shift around us. Trees appeared where there hadn't been trees before. The landmarks we'd passed were gone. And then we saw it. A figure stood in the distance, its outline barely visible through the haze of shadows. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long. Its head was tilted at an angle that made my stomach churn, and its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly in the dark. No one spoke. No one moved. The figure took a step forward, its movements jerky, as if it were being pulled by strings. "Run," the ranger whispered. We scattered, each of us darting in a different direction. The forest erupted with noise, the crashing of branches, the pounding of footsteps, and that awful growling, closer now, almost deafening. I ran blindly, branches clawing at my face and arms. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic like blood. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled into another clearing. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. The growling had stopped, but the silence was worse. I was alone, and then I heard it, a low whisper right behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I turned, but there was no one there. The forest watched, silent and unyielding. I froze, my body unwilling to move as the voice echoed in my ears. It was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It sounded like the forest itself had spoken, low, resonant, and full of something ancient. "You shouldn't be here," it said again, the words carrying from everywhere and nowhere. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. My flashlight had been knocked from my hand when I fell, and I fumbled to retrieve it. The beam cut through the dark, but the clearing seemed unnaturally vast, the trees at its edges shrouded in an impenetrable fog. "Hello," I called, my voice thin and weak. No response. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the clearing for any sign of my colleagues. Darren, the ranger, anyone. But I was alone. And then I saw it. At the far edge of the clearing, something emerged from the fog. It moved slowly, deliberately, its shape obscured but unmistakably human. My heart pounded as I stepped back, the soles of my boots sinking into the damp earth. "Stay back," I shouted, raising the flashlight like a weapon. The figure stopped. For a moment it seemed to study me, its head tilting to one side. Then it stepped forward again, the fog parting to reveal its features. It wasn't human. Not anymore. Its skin was a mottled gray, stretched taut over sharp bones. Its eyes were empty sockets, yet I felt its gaze pierce through me. Its mouth hung open, revealing jagged teeth that looked more like shards of broken glass. I stumbled back, my breath hitching. "What do you want?" The thing didn't answer. Instead, it raised one spindly arm and pointed at me. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and a deep, resonant hum filled the air. I turned to run, but the forest had changed. The trees loomed impossibly tall, their branches forming a cage around the clearing. Roots snaked across the ground, writhing like living things. I tripped and fell hard, my flashlight skittering away into the dark. Scrambling to my knees, I glanced back and saw the figure standing over me, its shadow stretching unnaturally long across the clearing. And then it spoke again. "You shouldn't be here." This time, the words were a roar, shaking the air and forcing me to cover my ears. The ground split open beneath me, a chasm yawning wide and spewing forth a foul, sulphurous stench. I screamed as I fell, the darkness swallowing me whole. When I woke, I was lying on the forest floor, the morning sun filtering through the trees. My body ached, my clothes were torn, and my hands were caked with dirt. I staggered to my feet, my head spinning. The clearing was gone, replaced by a dense thicket of trees. There was no sign of the chasm, no sign of the figure, and no sign of my group. Somehow, I found my way back to the lodge. The place was deserted. Tables and chairs were overturned, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and decay. I called out, but the only answer was the echo of my own voice. When I finally made it to the road, I flagged down a passing car. The driver, an older man with a weathered face, looked at me like I was a ghost. "You're lucky to be alive," he said as he drove me to the nearest town. "People go missing in those woods all the time. Most of them are never found." I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I don't think he would have believed me. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that I left something behind in those woods, or that something followed me out. At night, when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long, I hear it again. "You shouldn't be here." Now, let us venture further. Story 4. The wind howled through the trees, a relentless reminder of how isolated I was. The mountain range had been on my mind for days, drawing me in with a magnetic pull I couldn't ignore. They said the woods were haunted, that strange things happened to people who wandered too far off the beaten path. But those were just rumors, weren't they? Stories told around campfires, passed down to warn the naive. I had heard them all before. Stories of disappearances, eerie lights, and ghostly whispers in the dead of night. Still, the place called to me. The trail had been easy at first, winding through towering pines and patches of moss-covered stone. But the further I went, the more unsettling the landscape became. The forest seemed to close in around me, as though the trees were conspiring to block my path. The further I ventured, the more I felt something was watching me. By the time the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting the woods in a dim, amber light, I was deep into unfamiliar territory. My phone had lost signal hours ago, and I wasn't sure where I was anymore. The trail had disappeared beneath a thick layer of fallen leaves, and I had no choice but to keep pushing forward. My legs were tired, and the biting wind nipped at my skin, but there was no turning back. It was then that I saw it. At first, it looked like a trick of the light, a shadow among the trees, darker than the night itself, crouching at the edge of the woods. But as I drew closer, the shape became clearer. It was a small cabin, barely visible beneath the thick canopy, its wooden walls darkened with age. A single, crooked chimney puffed out a thin stream of smoke that seemed to curl unnaturally into the sky. My heart began to race as I approached. Who would build a cabin here in the middle of nowhere? I had heard of isolated cottages and hideaways, but this place felt different. Wrong somehow. I pushed the door open without thinking. It creaked loudly, as if protesting my intrusion, and the interior was dim and musty, filled with a thick, earthy smell of old wood and dampness. The fireplace had long since gone cold, its hearth choked with ash and forgotten logs. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the faint light of the dying day, settling over everything like a forgotten memory. Yet, despite its abandonment, something felt alive. The furniture was oddly placed. Old chairs around a fireplace that seemed to have been used recently. A rocking chair that creaked as though someone had just stood from it. A sense of unease washed over me. I knew I shouldn't be here, but I couldn't leave, not yet. I walked deeper into the cabin, each step echoing in the silence. The walls were lined with shelves filled with strange objects. Dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, dusty books with pages that looked as though they hadn't been touched in years. The wooden floor creaked beneath my feet, almost as if it were groaning in protest. Then I heard it, a soft, low whisper, so faint it might have been the wind. But it wasn't the wind. "You shouldn't be here." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. The voice was too clear to be imagined, too real. It came from somewhere deep within the cabin, echoing off the walls, reverberating in my skull. My pulse quickened, but I stayed rooted to the spot, my breath coming in shallow gasps. There was no one here. There couldn't be. I would have seen them by now. Another whisper, this time louder, more urgent. "You shouldn't be here." I felt it then. A presence, lurking in the shadows, watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. It wasn't just the whispering voice that unnerved me. It was the silence that followed. It was the way the air seemed to grow thicker, heavier, the closer I moved to the center of the room. I could feel it closing in on me, the walls pressing in, the darkness thickening. I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the dim corners of the room, looking for any sign of life. There was nothing, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My hands trembled as I reached for the old lamp sitting on a table beside the fireplace. The moment my fingers brushed against it, the room seemed to change. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room stretched unnaturally, as though they were alive, moving along the walls. Suddenly, the door to the far side of the cabin creaked open. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it stood ajar, revealing a narrow hallway that disappeared into complete darkness. A rush of panic flooded my chest, but some force, pushed me forward. The whisper came again, this time a jagged, fractured hiss, almost as if it were coming from the very walls themselves. "You shouldn't be here." I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to see what lay behind that door. I stepped into the darkness, my feet hesitant on the creaking wooden floorboards. My breath was visible in the cold air, my hands trembling as I reached forward. The hallway stretched on, its walls coated in peeling wallpaper, the floor covered in dust, as though no one had stepped foot in this place for years. But there was something about it, something wrong, that made my skin crawl. The deeper I walked, the more I felt the presence. It was heavier now, suffocating, as though something was breathing right behind me. A sudden gust of cold air rushed past me, and the door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into total darkness. I reached for the flashlight in my pocket, but when I turned it on, the beam illuminated nothing but empty air. The walls seemed to stretch on endlessly, narrowing in on me. And then I heard it. The voice, louder, sharper now. You shouldn't be here. But this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a scream, reverberating in the walls, echoing in my mind. The floor beneath my feet cracked and groaned as though the very cabin was alive, twisting and shifting. I turned to run, but the darkness closed in on me, swallowing me whole. The cold began to seep into my bones, making it hard to breathe. My heart was thundering in my chest as I stumbled through the hallway, trying to find my way back. But every time I took a step, the darkness seemed to stretch further, deeper, pulling me farther from the light. The walls seemed to close in around me, their rough surfaces scraping against my skin, and the air was thick, suffocating. I wanted to scream, but the only sound that escaped was a strangled gasp. The whisper was louder now, more insistent. It was as if the very structure of the cabin was alive, watching, waiting, mocking me for my foolishness. You shouldn't be here. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, vibrating through the walls, reverberating in my skull. It was a low, guttural sound, one that made my skin crawl and my teeth rattle. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't stop. The whispering only grew louder, drowning out all other sound. Then something shifted. I felt it before I saw it. A subtle change in the air, a ripple in the atmosphere that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The walls seemed to pulse, and I could feel the cabin's breath, slow and heavy, as though it was alive, as though it was breathing with me. I spun around, trying to find the source, but the hallway stretched on endlessly, a dark void that refused to let me go. I turned back toward the door, the one that led to the outside. But when I reached for the handle, my hand went through it, as though it had never existed. The door was gone, replaced by a solid wall of darkness. There was no escape. The whisper came again, and this time it wasn't just a voice. It was a presence. I could feel it behind me in the very air I breathed. It was something ancient, something that had lived here for far longer than I could comprehend. It wasn't just a warning. It was a command. You shouldn't be here. My breath came in ragged gasps now, the fear overwhelming me. I backed up against the wall, my hands trembling as I pressed my back to the cold, rough surface. The darkness seemed to press in on me, as though it were physically pulling me toward something, dragging me deeper into the heart of the cabin. I looked down, my eyes catching on something strange. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I stepped closer, I saw the marks on the floor. They were faint, barely noticeable, but they were there. Long, deep gouges in the wood, as if someone, had been dragged across the floor. The marks led down the hall, disappearing into the dark. With no other choice, I followed them. My feet moved on their own accord, as if my body had already surrendered to the cabin's will. The hallway opened into a small room, its walls lined with bookshelves and strange, arcane symbols. At the center of the room, there was a large table, covered in what appeared to be ritualistic items. Candles, bones, and ancient artifacts I couldn't begin to understand. The air in the room was thick with the scent of decay, and the temperature had dropped even further, my breath now visible in the air. In the far corner of the room stood a mirror. It was tall, framed in tarnished gold, its surface darkened with age. But as I stared into it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't my reflection. A figure stood behind me, its face hidden in shadows, its body impossibly tall and thin. I wanted to turn around, to flee, but my body refused to move. I was paralyzed, trapped in place, as the figure reached out toward me. The whisper came again, only this time, it wasn't a voice. "You shouldn't be here." It was a command, a demand. I felt an unnatural force tugging at my chest, pulling me toward the mirror. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to look at what was waiting for me, but my feet moved against my will, carrying me closer to the mirror's surface until I could feel the cold glass against my skin. I shut my eyes, desperate to escape, but when I opened them again, I was no longer in the cabin. The room was gone. The floor had disappeared beneath me, and I was standing on the edge of an abyss, a chasm so deep I couldn't see the bottom. The air was thick with fog, and all around me, I could hear whispers, thousands of voices, each one speaking the same thing. "You shouldn't be here." I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but there was no escape. The ground beneath me began to crack, and I felt myself falling into the endless dark. Suddenly, a hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing my wrist. I screamed, struggling against the grip, but it only tightened, pulling me further into the void. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. I was back in the cabin. The mirror was gone. The room was empty. The darkness lifted, and the whispering faded to a distant murmur. But I knew I wasn't alone. I stumbled to my feet, my mind spinning. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this place, but I couldn't remember the way. The walls had shifted, the floor had changed, and I was no longer sure what was real and what wasn't. The air was thick with the same oppressive presence that had followed me from the moment I stepped into the cabin. The whisper came again, but this time I didn't wait for it to finish. I bolted toward the door, desperate for escape. But when I reached it, I found it locked, barred from the inside. I turned in a panic, looking for any other exit, but there was nothing. And then, from the corner of the room, I heard it again. "You shouldn't be here." I had come too far to turn back now. The whispers were louder, more desperate, and I could feel the weight of the cabin's anger pressing down on me. The walls seemed to pulse with life, as though they were alive, feeding off my fear. But there was no escape. I don't know how much time passed before I finally gave in. The darkness swallowed me whole, and when I woke up, I was back outside, alone in the woods, miles from the cabin, with no memory of how I had gotten there. But the whispers didn't stop, and I knew that I would never be free. Story 5. The woods have always been a place of refuge for me, a place where I can lose myself, where the chaos of the world fades, and I'm left alone with the natural rhythm of the earth. I've always enjoyed hiking, trekking through untamed forests, and immersing myself in the silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves or the distant call of birds. But what happened to me in those woods has changed everything I thought I knew about fear. It started with a hiking trip, one of many I'd taken in the past. I'd packed my bag the night before, eager for the solitude of the trail. The trail I was heading for was a well-known path that wound through dense forests and led to a clearing where wildflowers bloomed and the view of the valley below was breathtaking. a weekend retreat of sorts, away from the buzz of the city. The morning was crisp and clear, the sun slowly rising above the horizon as I set out, the familiar scent of pine and earth greeting me with each step. I had taken this route before, a few times over the years, so the path felt familiar, safe even. My boots crunched against the leaves and dirt beneath me, the air filled with the sounds of nature. A bird calling from high above, the whisper of a breeze through the trees. It was calming. Hours passed as I hiked deeper into the woods, my body moving rhythmically with the terrain. I reached the clearing and sat on a large rock, pulling out my water and taking a sip. The view was as breathtaking as always, stretching for miles, with the mountains rising like guardians on the horizon. But this time something felt different. It was subtle at first, a prickle on the back of my neck, a sense that I wasn't alone. I glanced over my shoulder, but the trees were just trees, the shadows nothing more than that. I told myself it was nothing, just the isolation of being so far from civilization. I stood up and continued on the trail, deciding to push a little further into the forest. The light was beginning to wane, the sun dipping lower in the sky, and the woods were becoming quieter. The usual hum of insects and birds had died down, replaced by an almost unnatural stillness. My footsteps echoed louder now, more pronounced. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite place. I reached a fork in the path, a part of the trail I didn't remember. The signpost had fallen over, and the directions were obscured by the overgrowth. I hesitated, but only for a moment. I've always considered myself an experienced hiker, someone who could read the land well. I picked a path to the left, deciding to explore a bit further. The path narrowed as I went deeper, the trees crowding in on me, their branches twisted and gnarled. The woods felt almost suffocating now, as if the air itself was holding me in place. I started to feel a growing sense of unease, but I pushed it aside. It was just the growing dusk, the natural apprehension that comes with being out in the woods when the day is ending. Then I heard it, a rustling in the bushes to my right, something moving just beyond the edge of the trail. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, soft, deliberate, like something or someone was following me. I scanned the shadows, but the dense underbrush obscured anything that could be hiding there. My breathing quickened, but I tried to rationalize it. Animals, maybe. The woods were full of wildlife. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I kept walking, faster now, my eyes darting from one tree to the next, convinced that I could see movement at the corner of my vision. I wasn't imagining it. Whatever it was there. I heard the faintest footsteps behind me, too light to be a bear, too calculated to be a deer. It was almost as if someone was trying to stay hidden, to follow me without being detected. At this point, my unease had turned to full-fledged paranoia. I turned around, but there was no one there, only the shadows of the trees stretching longer with the setting sun. The path ahead seemed to stretch on forever, but my feet were growing heavier with each step. I needed to make a decision. Turn back, retrace my steps, and find a safer place for the night, or keep moving forward. I chose to keep going, thinking it was just my imagination running wild. But then it came again, the voice. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A whisper, so soft I almost didn't catch it. You shouldn't be here. My blood ran cold. I froze again, staring into the woods, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was familiar, disturbingly so, but I couldn't place it. It wasn't anyone I knew. It wasn't a voice I had ever heard before, but there it was, clear as day. The rustling came again, closer this time. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I stood rooted to the spot, as if the very earth beneath me had taken hold of my feet, keeping me in place. I swallowed hard, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly alone. The trees around me seemed to lean in, their branches stretching out like twisted hands, blocking the path ahead. The shadows deepened, growing long and foreboding, and I realized then that the trail had disappeared. I was lost. I turned again, desperate now, but the voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. You shouldn't be here. Leave. I spun around, my breath shallow, my pulse racing, but the forest remained still. No sign of anyone, no sign of anything except the oppressive silence pressing in on me. And then I saw it, a figure, a silhouette, standing just beyond the trees, shrouded in shadow. It was tall, too tall, its form unnaturally elongated, like a man, but not quite. Its eyes gleamed in the dimming light, two pinpricks of white that seemed to burn through the darkness. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, like it was looking right through me. The figure took a step forward, and I could hear the faintest sound, like the crackling of dead leaves underfoot. But the moment it moved, I was already running. I bolted down the path, not caring where I was going, not caring about anything but escape. My mind raced, my thoughts a blur, my feet carrying me faster than they ever had before, the sound of my own breathing drowning out everything else. I could hear the footsteps behind me, too closer, faster, relentless. I was being pursued. I didn't stop running until I found the edge of the forest, the familiar sight of the main trail, the clearing where the wildflowers grew. I stumbled through the underbrush, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure was gone, but the feeling of its presence lingered. I didn't look back. I made my way back to the cabin, the familiar path feeling like a lifeline. My mind was reeling, my body tense. The images of the figure and its eyes burned into my mind. I couldn't explain it, couldn't make sense of it. But I knew one thing for sure. I had been watched. I never went back into those woods. Couldn't. And even now, as I sit in my apartment, trying to push the memories out of my mind, I still hear that whisper in the dark. You shouldn't be here. Story 6. I've always enjoyed long drives. The road stretching out before me, the hum of the engine, the world passing by in a blur. There's a certain peace to it, an almost meditative quality, as the miles tick away. No distractions, no interruptions, just the solitude of the open road and the sound of tires against asphalt. But the drive that changed everything for me wasn't peaceful. It was far from it. It was a nightmare that started with something as simple as a wrong turn. It was late in the evening when I set out. I had taken a job in a small town far from home, and after a few months, I'd grown used to the quiet, the isolation. My friends and family had been gone for weeks, and I decided to head back for a weekend to see them. The town was small, not much to it. Just a few houses, a gas station, a diner that closed at sunset. But it was home, and after weeks of work and loneliness, I was eager to return. The drive was easy enough, or at least it should have been. The highway was mostly empty, save for the occasional passing car. The sky was dark, the stars barely visible through the haze of the city lights behind me. It was the kind of drive where I could let my mind wander, think about anything and everything. The sound of the radio barely kept me company as I lost myself in the rhythm of the road. But then, I noticed something strange. At first, it was barely noticeable. A flicker of movement in the rearview mirror. Car behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see a pair of headlights in the distance. But the road was empty. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe I had just imagined it. But then it happened again. I checked the mirror once more carefully this time, and saw something unsettling. A shadow, a figure, barely discernible, sitting in the back seat of the car behind me. It wasn't the shape of a person, it was more like a presence, an absence in the shape of a person. I shook my head, thinking I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The car behind me was still there too, but now it was much closer. I hadn't seen it approach, but there it was, tailing me with an unnatural precision. I could barely make out the headlights, but they seemed to be too bright, too focused. The figure in the rearview mirror didn't move, just sat there, unmoving. It was like the car and the shadow had been there the whole time, following me, waiting. I accelerated, my foot pressing harder on the gas pedal, the engine growling louder in protest. But no matter how fast I drove, the car behind me stayed right on my tail. I glanced over at the road ahead, trying to focus on anything other than the creeping sense of dread that was settling over me. The headlights of the car illuminated the road like twin searchlights, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch out endlessly. The longer I drove, the more unsettling it became. The silence in my car felt oppressive, heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but each time I did, the figure in the back seat of the car behind me remained motionless. There was no face, no shape to the figure, just the vague outline of a presence that seemed to grow darker with every passing mile. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe the fatigue was getting to me. But as the miles dragged on, I began to feel the weight of something terrible creeping in. I knew I had to get off the road, stop somewhere, but there was nothing for miles. The towns were too far apart, the rest stops few and far between. Then, in the distance, I saw something, a turnoff, a narrow, winding road that veered off the highway. Without thinking, I took it. My heart pounded in my chest as the road twisted and turned, the headlights of the car behind me still there, following without hesitation. It was a dead-end road, one I had never been down before. I had no idea where it led, but I had to get away from that car. The road was narrow and overgrown, the trees lining the path closing in on both sides. The silence was deafening now, broken only by the crunch of my tires on the gravel. I glanced over my shoulder again, but this time, the car was no longer behind me. It had vanished. I exhaled in relief, trying to calm my nerves. But then I realized something even more horrifying. I hadn't heard the car turn. There had been no screech of tires, no sound of an engine shifting gears. It had simply disappeared, as though it had never been there at all. I drove deeper down the winding road, the headlights cutting through the darkness like a blade. But as the minutes stretched on, I began to feel the same creeping unease return. It wasn't the road that unsettled me. It was the silence, the oppressive weight of it, pressing down on me like a suffocating force. The trees around me seemed to bend inward, the shadows they cast stretching unnaturally. I glanced in the rearview mirror once more, and this time, I didn't see the car. But there was something else, something far worse. A figure, standing at the edge of the road. It was tall, taller than any person should be, its body long and unnatural. Its arms were too long, its legs too thin, and its head was tilted to the side, staring directly at me with wide, empty eyes. I slammed on the brakes, heart racing, the car screeching to a halt. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, watching me. I could feel its gaze, cold and predatory, drilling into my soul. Couldn't breathe, couldn't move. For a long moment, nothing happened. The figure remained motionless, and I sat frozen in the driver's seat, my hands gripped tightly on the wheel. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanished into the trees, as though it had never been there. I didn't waste any time. I threw the car into reverse, slamming my foot on the gas pedal, and backed up as quickly as I could. The tires slid on the gravel, the car lurching as I struggled to regain control. But when I looked up, the road ahead was different. The trees had closed in, and the path was no longer the same. It had changed. The road was no longer winding. It was a straight line, leading deeper into the woods, and I knew that if I continued down it, I would never make it out. I turned around and sped back toward the highway, not looking back for fear of what I might see. The feeling of being watched never left me, not even as I finally reached the main road again. The figure in the rearview mirror was gone, but its presence lingered, like a shadow in the corners of my mind. When I finally made it to my destination, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed and raw. I never told anyone what had happened. No one would believe me, but as I lay in bed that night, trying to find sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, waiting for me, somewhere in the dark, watching, always watching. And the worst part, I knew that the road would always be there. That turnoff, that winding path through the woods. It was waiting for me to take it again. Story 7. I had always loved the quiet solitude of early mornings. There's something about the first light of day that feels like a promise, like the world is waking up with you, offering you a fresh start. It was why I'd chosen the cabin in the woods, far away from the noise of the city. I had rented it for a weekend getaway, hoping to clear my mind, to find some peace. The air was crisp as I stepped outside, the cold biting at my skin, but the sun hadn't risen yet. The fog was thick, lingering just above the ground like a living thing, wrapping the trees in a suffocating embrace. I could barely see beyond the porch of the cabin, the outlines of the forest hidden in the mist. It felt like the fog was holding its breath, waiting for something. I had arrived late the previous evening, too late to appreciate the surroundings. But now, in the half-light of dawn, I could see the isolation of the place. The cabin was situated deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to close in on the path leading to it. There were no neighbors here, just the sound of wind rustling through the branches and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. At first, the silence was a relief, but now, with the fog swirling around me, I felt a twinge of unease. I shrugged it off. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. The fog made everything feel otherworldly, but I wasn't about to let it get to me. I decided to go for a walk, hoping to clear my head. I slipped on my boots and made my way down the wooden steps, feeling the chill of the earth underfoot as I entered the forest. The fog clung to the ground, wrapping around my ankles as I walked deeper into the woods. I kept my pace slow, taking in the silence, the stillness. But then I heard it, a sound, soft at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. It was hard to tell where it was coming from, but it felt too close, too real. I stopped and turned in place, scanning the mist, but saw nothing. Just trees, just fog. The silence returned, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the wind. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt it. A presence just beyond the edge of my perception. Something was out there, something in the fog. I continued walking, pushing the thought from my mind, but the feeling wouldn't leave. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the woods were empty, the fog thickening with each step. That's when I heard it again. This time it was clearer, louder. A voice, faint but unmistakable. Help! The word hung in the air like a breath, caught between the trees. It wasn't a loud scream or a cry for attention, but a desperate whisper, as if the person speaking was lost, or worse, hiding. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice didn't come again, but I couldn't ignore it. There was no mistaking what I had heard. I wasn't alone. I looked around, but the fog had thickened to the point where I could barely see 5 feet in front of me. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their gnarled branches twisted and reaching, but there was no sign of anyone. The whisper had felt close, yet no one was there. I decided to keep moving, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were alive with unseen eyes, following my every step. My footsteps sounded too loud, too purposeful against the quiet hum of the forest. I tried to focus on the path ahead, but the mist seemed to shift around me, always just out of reach. Then, as I rounded a bend in the path, I saw something. A figure, just ahead, standing motionless in the fog. It was tall, too tall, and its form was obscured by the mist, but I could make out the outline of a person, standing unnaturally still. The air seemed to grow colder around me, and I couldn't help but take a cautious step forward. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling more than I wanted to admit. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't move. It didn't acknowledge me. I called again, but it remained still, its outline growing more indistinct as the fog thickened between us. I took another step, and this time, the figure seemed to melt into the mist, vanishing without a trace. My heart skipped a beat. Had I imagined it? Had I really seen something? Or was it just the fog playing tricks on my eyes? I stood still, listening. The woods were silent once more, the only sound the soft rustling of the trees in the breeze. But the unease had settled deeper into my bones. I was certain I wasn't alone, but whether it was a person or something else, I couldn't say. I continued walking, my steps quickening. The fog was growing denser, wrapping itself tighter around me. The trees were beginning to blur together, the forest now a labyrinth of indistinguishable trunks. And then, in the distance, I heard it again. Help! It was unmistakable this time. The voice wasn't distant, it was close, too close. I spun around, but the fog had completely swallowed the path behind me. There was no sign of the figure, no sign of anything but the oppressive weight of the mist. I was lost. Panic began to rise in my chest, and I pushed forward, trying to find my bearings. But the woods had changed. The trees no longer looked familiar. The path had disappeared, and the only sound I could hear was the thudding of my own heart in my ears. Help! The voice was louder now, coming from all around me. It wasn't a single person. It was many, all pleading for something, for salvation, for release. But who were they, and why were they here? I turned in every direction, but the fog was impenetrable. Couldn't see a thing. It was as if the forest itself had turned against me, shifting and twisting, hiding the way out. The voices grew louder, overlapping, their desperation crawling under my skin. I stumbled forward, my mind spiraling as the voices seemed to pull me deeper into the woods. The cold was unbearable now, and the air felt heavier with each breath. I could barely keep my eyes open, the fog blurring everything into a dreamlike haze. And then I felt something, a cold touch on the back of my neck, like fingers brushing against my skin. I whipped around, but there was nothing, no one, just the fog and the trees. The voices were still there, still calling for help. But now, I could hear them clearly, coming from somewhere just behind me. I turned slowly, afraid of what I might find. And then I saw it, the figure. It was standing just a few feet away, its form barely visible in the dense fog, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. It was taller than before, its body twisted in unnatural angles. Its arms were long, too long, hanging at its sides like vines. And its face was empty, hollow, a featureless mask of pale skin stretched too thin over the bones of its skull. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure tilted its head, as if observing me, and then, without a sound, it reached out. The touch was cold, colder than anything I had ever felt. It wrapped around my wrist like a vice, pulling me toward it. The voices were gone now, replaced by the sharp, guttural whisper of the figure. "You shouldn't be here." The words scraped against my mind, sending a shock of terror through me. I tried to pull away, but its grip tightened, dragging me deeper into the fog. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like claws, and I knew then that I wasn't going to make it out. I couldn't escape. The last thing I heard before the world went black was its voice again, echoing in my mind. "You shouldn't be here." Story 8. I didn't want to go. It's hard to explain why, but something about the house just didn't feel right. I had been following the old road for hours, the gravel crunching beneath my tires as I drove deeper into the woods, when I saw it. The house, perched at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees as if it were trying to escape the light of day. It was an old farmhouse, large, weathered, its windows dark and still, the sort of place you would drive by and quickly forget. But I didn't forget. Something about the house lingered in my mind. I had been traveling for days, and the last thing I wanted was to stop at some isolated farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. But the evening was creeping in, and I had no choice but to turn onto the narrow driveway. The tires of my car squealed in protest as I pulled to a stop in front of the porch, the house looming in front of me like a silent sentinel. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the wood scraping against the frame, reluctant to let me in. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence envelop me, the only sound being the faint rustling of leaves in the trees outside. I should have turned around. The sensible part of me knew this, but the rest of me, curious, drawn to the mystery, couldn't help but step inside. The air was thick with dust, a stale scent that reminded me of things long abandoned. I could feel the weight of time in the walls, the house old enough to have swallowed the secrets of those who lived here before. The foyer was dim, a flickering light above casting eerie shadows on the worn floors. I hesitated, wondering if I should leave, but there was something different about this place, something beyond the mere decrepitude. I moved through the house, each step tentative, as if I were walking through the remnants of someone else's memory. There was an old rocking chair by the fireplace, its creaky rhythm unnervingly steady despite the absence of anyone to sit in it. A faded rug on the floor, a portrait on the wall, the figures in the painting staring out at me with lifeless eyes. It was the basement door that caught my attention. It was tucked at the end of the hall, partially hidden behind a thick curtain. There was a faint light coming from beneath it, not enough to reveal the room below, but enough to stir something deep in me, something that whispered, "Go down there." Couldn't ignore it. I stepped closer, the creaking of the floorboards beneath me loud in the silence. The door was old, the wood cracked and splintered, but the lock was gone, as if the house itself had abandoned the idea of keeping anyone away. I hesitated once more before pushing the door open. The basement was damp, the air cool and heavy. I could see nothing but the faint light coming from a bulb hanging low overhead. The stairs creaked as I descended, each step taking me deeper into the bowels of the house. The light flickered again, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move at the bottom of the stairs. But when I blinked, it was gone. There was something down here. I could feel it. At the bottom of the stairs, the light revealed a small, low-ceilinged room. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with boxes and old furniture. But what caught my eye was the wooden crate in the center of the room. It was small, no larger than a coffee table, but it had a strange aura around it. I moved toward it, drawn to the box as though it were calling me. The moment I touched the lid, I felt a jolt run through me, cold, sharp, like an electric shock. I pulled my hand back instinctively, but the sensation lingered, as though the box had marked me. I hesitated. I knew I shouldn't open it, but something inside me urged me to. My curiosity won out. I pried the lid open, wincing at the sound of the wood scraping against the edges. Inside was a bundle of old, yellowed papers, tied together with a frayed string. I pulled them out, my fingers trembling as I untied the string and unfolded the papers. They were filled with scrawled handwriting, dense and hurried, as though the writer had been desperate to get something down before time ran out. I began to read. The words were hard to decipher, but one thing was clear. The writer spoke of whispers, voices that came from beneath the floorboards, voices that could drive a person mad. They won't stop, one line read. They never stop. They're hungry. They want you to listen. Don't listen. The more I read, the more I felt that familiar sensation of unease creeping into my bones. The whispers, the voices, they had been here before. The writer had heard them too. I set the papers down, my hands shaking. The room felt colder now, the silence suffocating. And then, from somewhere deep in the floor, I heard it. A whisper. At first, it was faint, just a murmur, like someone speaking from far away. But then it grew louder, clearer. You shouldn't be here. The voice was coming from the floor itself, from deep within the earth. I could feel it vibrating through the walls, through my bones. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. My heart raced as the whispers continued to echo around me. Louder now, urgent, desperate. Get out! The floor beneath me groaned as if something were stirring beneath it. The air was thick, stifling, and I felt a cold draft sweep through the room, pushing me toward the door. But I couldn't leave. I couldn't tear myself away from the voices. You have to listen, the voice pleaded. You have to understand. It won't stop until you do. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I finally broke free of the invisible hold that had kept me in place. I scrambled for the stairs, stumbling over my own feet as the whispers followed me, louder and more insistent with every step. I reached the top of the stairs and slammed the basement door shut behind me, the sound reverberating through the house. The silence was deafening, but even then, I could still hear them, faintly at first, and then growing louder as I backed away from the door. You shouldn't have come here. The whispers didn't stop. They never stopped. They were inside the walls, beneath the floorboards, in the very air I breathed. I ran. I didn't look back as I fled the house, my car forgotten in the driveway. I just ran, through the woods, away from the house that had tried to claim me. And when I finally reached the road, I didn't stop until I was miles away. But even now, as I lie awake at night, I hear them, the whispers, faint and distant, calling to me from somewhere deep within the earth. I can never escape them, and I don't know how long it will be before they find me again. Story 9. It's funny how dreams work. You think you know something, you think you understand it, but then you wake up and everything shifts. You forget the edges, the details, and sometimes even the person you were when you were lost in sleep. But there's one dream I can never forget, no matter how much I want to. I've tried to let it go. I've tried to push it away, convince myself it's just my mind playing tricks. But it's always there. Starts the same way every time. I'm standing at the edge of a long, empty road. The asphalt cracked and worn from years of neglect. There's no sign of life, no cars, no people. Just the endless stretch of road and a thick fog that clings to the ground like a living thing. The air is damp, heavy with the scent of earth and decay, and I can hear nothing but my own footsteps as they echo against the silence. I don't know where I am or how I got here, but somehow I know that I'm supposed to be walking down that road. It's always like that in the dream. There's something I'm supposed to do, but I'm not sure what it is. The uncertainty gnaws at me, but I continue on, drawn forward as if something is waiting for me at the end. Sometimes I think I hear a voice calling me, a whisper on the wind. It's never clear, never loud enough to make out, but it's there, just beyond the fog, urging me to go farther. I don't listen, not at first. I keep walking one step after another until the road begins to twist. The fog thickens, and I can feel the air turning colder, heavier. The sky above is a dull gray, the clouds swirling like they're being drawn into some unseen vortex. That's when I see it. It's a house, standing alone in the distance, half hidden by the fog. Its shape is strange, its outline not quite right, as if it's been pulled from the edges of my mind and placed here, in this dream. The windows are dark, the door ajar, but there's something about it that calls to me, something almost familiar. The moment I step onto the porch, I can hear it, the creaking of old wood, the sound of something moving inside. It's like the house itself is alive, groaning and shifting, as though it's waiting for me. And that's when I remember, the house is mine, not in the way that it belongs to me in the waking world, but in the dream it's mine. I don't know how I know this, I don't know when it happened, but it's unmistakable. I push the door open, the hinges protesting, and step inside. The air is thick with dust and the smell of old wood. The house is dark, but I don't need light to see. There's something about the way the darkness presses against the walls, something that makes it feel wrong, like it's not supposed to be this way. The walls are lined with pictures, old photographs of people I don't recognize, their faces obscured by the shadows. I move deeper into the house, each room more unsettling than the last. The floorboards creak beneath my weight, and the silence is overwhelming, suffocating. I reach the kitchen, and there, lying on the counter, is a small, delicate object. It's a glass pendant, its surface smooth and cool to the touch. I don't know what it is, but it feels important. That's when I hear it again. The whisper. It's louder now, clearer, like a voice calling my name from the depths of the house. The sound isn't coming from anywhere specific. It's everywhere, all around me, a soft, constant hum. I follow the sound, moving down the dark hall, the air growing colder with each step. The walls close in, the hallway narrowing, twisting, until it feels like I'm walking through a tunnel, a passage leading to something I can't see. At the end of the hall, there's a door. It's closed, but the whisper is coming from behind it. I reach for the knob, and as my fingers make contact with the cold metal, a chill runs through me, deep and unrelenting. The door opens on its own, as if it knows I'm coming, as if it's been waiting for me. I step inside. The room is small, dimly lit by a single candle burning in the corner. The walls are lined with shelves, and on the floor, there's an old rug, its fibers worn and faded. But it's the figure in the center of the room that catches my attention. It's a woman. She's sitting on the floor, her back turned to me, her face hidden in her hands. Her body is shaking, trembling as if she's crying, though there's no sound. I feel a sudden wave of sorrow wash over me, a deep, aching sadness that pulls at my chest. I want to help her, but I don't know how. I reach out, but as my hand touches her shoulder, she looks up. Her eyes are empty. There's nothing there, no soul, no spark of life. Just the hollow, lifeless void of her gaze. I freeze. Her mouth opens, but the words that come out are not hers. They'll never stop, the voice says. It's cold, mechanical, as if it's been stripped of emotion, but there's an underlying desperation. They've been here for so long. They never leave. You'll never leave. The room begins to shift, the walls warping and stretching, the light from the candle flickering as though it's being smothered. The shadows grow long, thick, until they seem to swallow the room whole. I try to step back, but my legs are frozen. I can't move. The whispers are louder now, all around me, rising into a cacophony of voices, 1,000 souls screaming at once. And then the floor gives way. I fall down, 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 through the darkness. And then, just as quickly as it started, I wake up. But the dream isn't over. The moment I open my eyes, I know something is wrong. The world feels different, as if the air itself is thicker, heavier. I sit up in bed, my heart pounding, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I look around. The room is the same, but the whispers, they're here. I hear them, soft and persistent, like the hum of electricity running through the walls. And the worst part, I don't know if I'm still dreaming or if I'm awake. Story 10. There's a place I avoid, one that I can never shake from my mind, no matter how far I run. It's not a place on any map, nor one that exists in any real sense. But every time I close my eyes, I find myself there. It started years ago, back when I was still a child. I was never one to be easily frightened, even when the other kids in the neighborhood told their stories about the strange house at the end of the street. They said it was haunted, abandoned for years, the windows boarded up, the garden overgrown with twisted vines and weeds. They said there was a terrible curse on the place, that it claimed anyone who dared to step inside. I didn't believe it, of course. I thought it was all just childish superstition, the kind of thing people made up to scare each other. So one day, I decided I'd go see it for myself. I had to. The house stood at the very edge of town, at the end of a narrow, winding street where no one dared to walk. The trees around it seemed to lean in, their branches twisted like hands reaching toward the sky, as if they were trying to shield the house from the world. The moment I stepped onto the property, I felt a shift in the air. It was as if the atmosphere itself grew heavy, pressing down on me, thick with something unseen, something ancient. But I didn't turn back. The front door was ajar, and I pushed it open with a creak. The sound of it echoed through the house, like a warning. Inside, the air smelled musty, stale, as if the walls themselves were suffocating. I took a step forward, and the floorboard beneath me groaned in protest. The walls were lined with old paintings, portraits of people whose eyes seemed to follow me as I moved. The furniture was draped in dusty sheets, and a strange silence filled the house, a silence that felt too still, too perfect. I wandered through the rooms, the oppressive feeling growing heavier with each passing second. Every room seemed to lead into another, and each corridor was darker, more suffocating than the last. It wasn't until I reached the basement that I found it, the thing that would stay with me, haunting me for the rest of my life. I had no intention of going down there. Something in my gut told me not to, but my curiosity got the better of me. The door to the basement was slightly cracked, as if it had been waiting for someone to open it. I grabbed the rusted handle and pulled. The basement was darker than anything I'd ever seen, the shadows deep and heavy, swirling in a way that didn't seem natural. I could barely see my hand in front of my face. I stepped down one foot after the other until I reached the bottom. The floor was cold, damp beneath my shoes. The air was thick, like I was breathing through something viscous. The only sound was the faint hum of something waiting. At the far end of the room, in the corner where the shadows seemed darkest, I saw it. A symbol etched into the floor. It wasn't drawn with ink or chalk. This was something more permanent, something carved into the stone itself. The lines were intricate, winding in a spiral, radiating outward from a central point. The design was alien, unfamiliar, yet it felt as though it had always been there, waiting for me to discover it. I should have turned around. I should have run, but I didn't. I knelt down, reaching out to touch the symbol. The moment my fingers brushed the cold stone, a jolt of cold shot up my arm, like a current of electricity. I recoiled, my heart pounding in my chest, but the damage was done. The floor beneath me seemed to tremble, and the air shifted again. The walls groaned, as though the house itself were coming alive. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, I heard it. A whisper, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. I froze. The voice didn't come from anywhere I could see. It wasn't from the walls, nor the air. It was coming from within me. You should have left when you had the chance. I didn't understand. Couldn't. The voice was inside my mind, resonating in my skull, echoing in the deepest corners of my thoughts. It was like a memory I had forgotten, like something familiar and ancient. The more I heard it, the more I realized it wasn't a warning. It was a curse. The basement door slammed shut behind me with a force that made the floor vibrate. I spun around, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, but I still couldn't see anyone. I was alone, trapped in that suffocating space. The symbol on the floor began to glow faintly, its lines shimmering like a fire that had been smoldering for years. The air grew heavier still, and I could feel something, someone watching me, waiting. The whispering voice came again, but now it was clearer, more urgent. You've been marked, and that's when I saw it. A shape appeared in the corner of my vision, shifting in the shadows. It was a figure barely visible, wrapped in the darkness itself, its form barely more than a silhouette. But what struck me wasn't its shape, it was its eyes. Two pinpricks of light, glowing from within the shadows, fixed on me. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at it, but the moment my gaze locked with those eyes, I felt the pull. My heart raced, my breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't move. It was like I was frozen in place, held by something unseen, something far more powerful than anything I had ever encountered. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving only the darkness in its wake. I ran. I didn't stop until I was out of the house, my legs trembling, my mind reeling. But even after I left, even as I stood in the light of day, I couldn't escape the feeling that I hadn't truly left, that something dark had followed me, something that would never let go. I don't visit that place anymore. I never went back, and I never will. But the mark is still there. Every time I close my eyes, I feel the weight of it, like something pressing against my chest. It's a heavy, suffocating feeling, and it's always with me. The whispers never stop, and the eyes, they are always watching. Story 11. The ocean has always held a strange power over me. Growing up near the coast, I spent countless hours by the water, watching the endless expanse of blue stretch to the horizon. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was comforting, like a lullaby I could never get enough of. But there's something about the ocean that always unsettled me, something hidden beneath its tranquil surface. When I was younger, I had heard the stories that no one really talked about, but that everyone knew. They were the kind of stories whispered in hushed tones, told around campfires or in darkened rooms, the kind that made you feel like you should never, ever venture too far from the shore. But I didn't listen. I was invincible, untouchable. It wasn't until years later, after I had left my small seaside town and moved to the city, that I began to truly understand what those stories meant. It happened during a vacation back home, a visit I had been looking forward to for weeks. I was older now, no longer a child, but something about that familiar coastline still drew me in. I rented a small cabin just off the beach, a place I'd often visited with my family when I was younger. It was isolated, a peaceful retreat away from the world, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could truly relax. I spent my days walking the shoreline, listening to the sound of the waves, watching the gulls wool overhead. But even though the days were perfect, sunny, warm, and clear, something felt off, like a pressure building in the air. The wind seemed to carry whispers, like voices in the distance, just beyond my hearing. I tried to dismiss it. It was just my imagination, I told myself. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep, blood red, I decided to take one last walk along the beach. The air was growing cooler, and the waves had taken on a darker hue, almost black against the fading light. The whispers I had heard earlier returned, this time clearer, like a distant murmur carried on the wind. I stopped in my tracks, my heart suddenly racing. It was then that I noticed something strange, something that shouldn't have been there. The figure. It was standing at the water's edge, just beyond the reach of the waves. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light, but as I drew closer, I saw it more clearly. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. The figure stood motionless, facing the ocean, completely still. I couldn't make out any details at first, just a vague outline against the darkening sea. The longer I looked, the more wrong it seemed. There was something about it, something unnatural, something that made my skin crawl. The person was too still, too silent. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their presence, like an oppressive weight in the air. I wanted to call out, ask if they were all right, but my voice caught in my throat. The wind shifted, and with it came a terrible, hollow sound, a low, mournful wail that seemed to rise from the very depths of the ocean. It was a sound I couldn't place, like the voice of something lost, something trapped. It echoed across the beach, sending a chill down my spine. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the sound. It was as if it didn't even hear it. I took a step forward, instinctively drawn toward the figure, but as I did, I felt something pull at me from within the water. A coldness, sharp and biting, crept up my legs, and I felt my feet sink slightly into the sand. I stopped, suddenly aware of how much closer I had gotten to the figure. It was now only a few feet away from me, but I still couldn't see its face. The darkness around it seemed to cling to it, like a shadow that refused to be shaken. I should have turned back, I should have run, but the whispers, the ones I'd been hearing all evening, were now louder, more insistent. They weren't words, not exactly. More like a pull, a tug on my mind, urging me closer, urging me to step into the water. The figure turned. For a moment I thought I was imagining it, but no. There was definitely a shift in its posture, an unnatural twist of its body, as if it was slowly unfolding, like something that had been crouched and was now stretching itself out. My breath caught in my throat as I saw its face for the first time. It was not human. It wasn't the face of a person at all, but something far worse. The skin was pale and stretched too tightly. The eyes hollow, dark sockets where nothing but the endless void of the sea stared back at me. Its mouth hung open, but there was no sound, no voice, just the distant, wailing call from the depths of the ocean. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It reached out, slowly, deliberately, and I felt the ice-cold air rush toward me, as though the creature itself was pulling the very ocean into the land. The water surged forward, rising higher than it should have, the waves crashing in a violent, chaotic rhythm, as if answering to the thing before me. And then the whispers stopped. For a long moment, everything went silent. The ocean stilled. The air hung heavy, thick with tension. I knew in that moment that it wasn't a person. It wasn't even alive in any sense I understood. It was something that had come from the deep, from the spaces where the light never reached. A thing that had been waiting, patient, for someone like me to find it. The creature stepped closer, and I could feel the cold press against my skin, like the touch of death itself. I took a step back, then another, stumbling in the sand, my feet unsteady beneath me. That was when I heard it, a voice, soft and garbled, rising from the depths of the ocean. "You shouldn't have come." I turned and ran, not stopping to look back, not daring to see the creature any longer. The sound of my feet slapping against the sand was drowned out by the crashing waves and the haunting wail of the thing from the water. I didn't stop until I was back at the cabin, door locked and windows sealed tight. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face again, those hollow eyes, that twisted mouth. And the whispers, they never stopped. They followed me, always just beyond my hearing, like a constant presence at the back of my mind. I never went back to the beach. I never returned to that place again. The ocean had taken something from me, something I could never get back. But I still hear the whispers, and I still feel it, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for me to return. Story 12. When I first moved into the old house on the outskirts of town, I had no idea what I was walking into. It was an unremarkable place, nestled between the forest and the sprawling fields that seemed to stretch on forever. From the outside, it was nothing special, just a two-story building with peeling paint, a sagging porch, and a roof that had seen better days. But there was something about it that drew me in, a curiosity, a strange sense of inevitability. The house had been abandoned for years, or so I was told. It was too far removed from the town to be a popular place, and most people simply avoided it. I didn't care about the rumors. I was young, eager for a new start. I had just ended a relationship that had drained me emotionally, and I wanted to be far away from the memories. The house, with its quiet seclusion, was perfect. It had a strange charm to it that I couldn't quite explain, and the price was right. Felt like the right place for a new beginning, a fresh chapter. The first night I spent there, I thought I was just being paranoid. The wind howled outside, rattling the old windows. The house creaked and groaned in the night, as old houses tend to do. I couldn't help but notice the faint sound of something else, a soft scraping like nails on wood. But it was so faint, so distant, that I convinced myself it was just the wind or the house settling. The next day I explored the house. It was a sprawling place, with rooms I hadn't even noticed when I first viewed it. There was the main floor, which consisted of a living room, kitchen, and dining area. Then there was the narrow staircase leading up to the second floor, where several bedrooms and a small bathroom waited. But it wasn't the rooms that drew my attention. It was the attic. I hadn't even seen the door at first, hidden behind an old bookshelf in one of the upstairs rooms. When I discovered it, I hesitated, wondering what could be up there. The house had an eerie quality to it, something unsettling that I couldn't quite put into words. Still, my curiosity got the best of me. I pulled the bookshelf aside, revealing the narrow door that led to the attic. It was locked, but a quick search of the house revealed a key hidden in the kitchen drawer. I took the key, unlocked the door, and stepped into the attic. It was smaller than I expected, cramped and dusty, with cobwebs clinging to the beams overhead. There were boxes stacked against the walls, old furniture draped in sheets, and a musty smell that seemed to cling to everything. But what struck me immediately were the drawings. They covered the walls, hastily scrawled images, some crude, some intricate, but all of them disturbing. Figures with hollow eyes, twisted faces, and distorted limbs. Faces that seemed to be staring at me, watching me, even though they weren't real. I took a step closer to one of the drawings, my heart thumping in my chest, and saw that it was different from the others. It wasn't just a figure. It was a house, drawn in intricate detail. The lines were almost too precise, too perfect. The drawing depicted the very house I was standing in, but there was something wrong about it. The windows were too dark, the door too wide, and in the center of the house, drawn in stark black ink, was a shape that I couldn't quite make out. It looked like a figure hunched over, but it had no face. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I traced the edges of the drawing with my finger. The sensation of being watched returned, this time more intense. I quickly backed away, my mind racing. Who had made these drawings? Why were they here? I tried to push the thought from my mind, but it wouldn't go away. That night I couldn't sleep. The house seemed alive, creaking and groaning like it was whispering secrets in the dark. The scraping sound returned, louder this time, came from above me, from the attic. I told myself it was just the house settling, just the wind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I decided to investigate. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed to the second floor, then made my way up to the attic. As I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. It hadn't been like that when I left earlier. My heart raced as I stepped into the attic, half expecting to find someone there. But there was no one, just the dust, the boxes, and the drawings. Except one of the drawings was missing. I looked around, confused, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The drawing of the house, the one with the faceless figure in the center, was gone. My breath quickened as I scanned the room. There was no trace of it. It had simply vanished. A sharp sound from behind me made me spin around, heart in my throat. I froze. There, standing in the far corner of the attic, was a figure. It was the shape from the drawing. The faceless figure, hunched over, its body twisted and unnatural. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, as still as death itself. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, all I could do was stare. Then it moved. Slowly, it lifted one arm, its fingers elongated and sharp, like claws. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. It was coming from its hand, dragging across the wooden floor. I backed away, my legs trembling, my mind screaming for me to run, but I couldn't move. The figure's hollow presence seemed to fill the room, suffocating me, trapping me in place. Finally, I broke free of the paralysis. I turned and fled, stumbling down the stairs, not daring to look back. My breath was ragged, my heart pounding in my chest as I burst out of the house into the night. The wind howled around me, but it was the silence of the house that haunted me the most. The silence that followed me, that seemed to press against my ears, like something was still watching me from the windows. I left the house that night. I didn't even take my things. I drove until the lights of the town were far behind me, the house fading into the distance. But even now, months later, I can still feel its presence. I can still hear the scraping sound, faint but persistent, like a warning. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear the faint sound of a door creaking open, somewhere far behind me. That house still stands, forgotten by most, but I'll never forget it, and I'll never go back. Story 13. There's a place in every town that people avoid, a building that everyone talks about but never dares to enter. For me, that place was the old house on Wraith Street, a decrepit, decaying mansion that had stood at the end of the road for longer than anyone could remember. The locals had their stories about it, each one more outlandish than the last. Some said it was haunted, others swore it was cursed. But the one thing they all agreed on was this: no one who went inside ever came back the same. I had always been the curious type, the one who didn't believe in ghost stories or curses. I thought it was all just superstition, the kind of thing that people tell each other to spice up their mundane lives. But that changed one summer evening when I found myself standing in front of the house, my hand resting on the rusted gate that separated me from the darkened property beyond. The house loomed before me, towering over the street like a sentinel, its broken windows staring out at me like hollow eyes. The lawn had long since been overtaken by weeds, and the front door hung ajar, creaking in the wind. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, the kind of scent that makes your stomach churn and your skin crawl. Yet, for all its desolation, the house seemed to draw me in, like it was calling me, beckoning me to enter. I don't know what exactly made me step through that gate, but I did. Maybe it was the curiosity, or maybe it was the strange, undeniable pull I felt. Whatever it was, I was already walking up the overgrown path, the gravel crunching beneath my boots, before I could even think to turn back. The door creaked open at my touch, the hinges groaning in protest. I hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside. The air in the house was heavy, thick with dust and age. The dim light filtering in through the cracked windows barely illuminated the hallway, casting long, eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The walls were adorned with faded portraits of long-dead relatives, their eyes following me as I moved deeper into the house. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine, telling myself it was just an old house, just an abandoned building. There was nothing to be afraid of. But then I heard it, a whisper, soft at first, so faint I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. It came from somewhere deeper in the house, from the direction of the staircase that led to the second floor. The whisper was too quiet to make out, but it sent a chill down my spine, like fingers brushing against my skin in the dark. I stood frozen for a moment, waiting for the sound to come again. When it did, it was clearer, though still indistinct. It was a word, or perhaps a name, a murmur that seemed to rise from the very walls of the house itself. It was like the house was alive, breathing, speaking. I didn't move. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I listened, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, as though it was trying to communicate something, trying to tell me something important. But whatever it was just out of reach, like a word you almost know but can't quite remember. I should have left. I should have turned and walked right out the door. But instead, I did the opposite. I followed the whisper. Up the stairs I went, my footsteps echoing through the house as I ascended into the darkness. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing colder with each step. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and as I reached the top of the stairs, they became clear enough that I could almost hear what they were saying. "You shouldn't be here," the words echoed in my mind, repeating over and over again like a mantra. "You shouldn't be here." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was like the house itself was speaking to me, its walls vibrating with each word. I turned around, but the stairs behind me were empty, the house silent once again. But I wasn't alone. I felt it then, the weight of something watching me, the heavy presence of something lurking just out of sight. I looked down the hallway, my pulse quickening as I noticed something I hadn't seen before. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of light spilling out from within. Compelled by something I couldn't explain, I walked toward it. As I approached the door, I felt a coldness settle over me, a bone-chilling draft that seemed to seep from the room beyond. My breath came in shallow gasps as I reached for the door, pushing it open just a crack. And then I saw it. In the middle of the room, a figure stood. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs twisted and elongated in a way that no human body should ever be. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could see the faint outline of something wrong. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting the dim light in a way that made my blood run cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The whispering began again, louder this time, as though the house itself was urging me to listen, to understand. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed, trapped in place by the figure in front of me. And then, in the stillness, it spoke. "Leave. Now." The words came out in a rasping, gurgling voice, as though they were spoken through a throat that hadn't seen use in years. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on me. I turned and ran, stumbling down the hallway, my heart racing in my chest. Behind me, I could hear the sound of the figure following, its footsteps dragging across the floor like dead weight. I didn't stop until I reached the front door, throwing it open and stumbling out into the night. The cold air hit me like a shock to the system, but it didn't bring me relief. The whispering followed me, echoing in my mind, like the house was still calling me back, urging me to return. But I couldn't. I never went back to that house, and I never spoke of what happened to anyone. The house still stands on Wraith Street, abandoned and forgotten by most. But every now and then, when I pass by, I swear I can hear it. The whispers, faint but persistent, calling to anyone who will listen. And I wonder what happens to those who listen too long. Story 14. I had always been the kind of person who believed in the safety of routine. My life, mundane as it may have seemed to others, was a carefully orchestrated pattern. I lived alone in a small, rented apartment on the outskirts of town, just far enough to escape the bustle but close enough to remain connected. I worked at a local bookstore, a place where I could disappear into the pages of novels while the world outside carried on without me. The quiet suited me. The calm was comforting. But then everything changed the night I received the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, the same as every other week. I remember because I had just finished my shift at the bookstore, and the sun had barely begun to dip below the horizon. The letter was simple, unmarked, with no return address, just a plain white envelope sitting in my mailbox. At first, I thought it was some sort of mistake. I didn't know anyone who would send me mail, and I certainly hadn't expected anything. I opened it with a slight sense of curiosity, my fingers brushing over the edge of the paper as I unfolded it. The letter inside was handwritten in bold, uneven strokes, the ink smeared in places as though the writer had been in a hurry. The words were simple, and yet they chilled me to the bone. You are not alone. I have been watching. My heart skipped a beat. I had never received anything like this before. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the message cryptic and unsettling. The words didn't make sense. I lived alone. I was certain of it. There was no one who could possibly have been watching me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That letter, it didn't feel like a prank. It felt too personal, too deliberate. I crumpled it up and tossed it into the trash, telling myself it was nothing, just some strange coincidence. But the unease lingered. That night, I locked all the doors and windows before bed, something I never bothered with before. I always prided myself on the safety of my apartment, but after the letter, something had changed. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hours ticked by, the quiet of my apartment settling over me like a heavy blanket. But as I lay in bed, something kept tugging at the edges of my thoughts, a sensation I couldn't ignore. It wasn't until I heard it, a faint tapping sound, that I realized something was wrong. It was coming from the window. At first, I dismissed it as the wind, maybe a tree branch brushing against the glass. But as the sound grew louder, more insistent, I realized that it wasn't the wind at all. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Someone, or something, was tapping against my window. My heart raced. I sat up in bed, the silence around me suddenly deafening. I wanted to ignore it, to pull the covers over my head and pretend it wasn't happening. But the sound was too clear. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a branch. I crept out of bed, my breath shallow and erratic, and approached the window. I hesitated before pulling back the curtain, my fingers trembling as I parted the fabric. There was nothing there. I exhaled, my heart still pounding, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild. Maybe the letter had gotten to me more than I realized. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone. I sat back down on the bed, trying to calm myself, when I heard it again. A soft thump, followed by the unmistakable sound of scratching. It was coming from the wall behind me. I froze, unable to move. My eyes darted to the wall, my mind racing. There was no way. No one could have gotten into my apartment without me hearing them. I had checked the locks, double-checked them. No one could have gotten in. And yet, the scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like something or someone was trying to get my attention. I grabbed my phone and called the police. My voice shook as I explained the situation, but when they arrived, they found nothing. No intruder, no sign of forced entry. The officers assured me that I was probably just imagining things. It was a quiet neighborhood, they said. Nothing ever happened here. But the scratching didn't stop. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and fear. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't sleep. The sounds came every night. Scratching, tapping, faint whispers just at the edge of my hearing. It was as though something or someone was trying to make contact, trying to reach me in the silence of my apartment. Then one night, I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the tapping. It wasn't the scratching. It was a voice, a low, gravelly voice that came from somewhere in the dark. "I've been waiting for you." I sat up, wide-eyed, my breath caught in my throat. The voice seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the walls, seeping into my bones. My body was frozen, paralyzed by fear, but I knew, deep down, that I had to leave. I had to get out of there. I ran out of my apartment, not stopping until I was standing on the street outside, gasping for breath. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. The police were called again. This time they checked the entire building. But once again they found nothing. No signs of an intruder. No explanations. Just silence. But the voice continued. It wasn't until a week later, after I had moved out of the apartment and into a new place, that I finally learned the truth. A neighbor had approached me while I was moving my things. He told me the story of the apartment. He said it had been empty for years, that no one had lived there for as long as he could remember. He told me about the previous tenant, a woman who had lived there alone until one night she had vanished without a trace. The police had never been able to find her. Her name was scratched into the wall, hidden under layers of paint. The woman's name? My name. I left town the very next day. Story 15. It was the kind of night that unsettles the soul. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale, sickly glow over the landscape. The air was still, yet thick with an unsettling weight, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. And, as I stood at the edge of the forest, I couldn't help but feel as though something was watching me. The trail before me was narrow and winding, its path barely visible in the dim light. The trees, tall and twisted, loomed over the path like dark sentinels, their branches heavy with the weight of unspoken secrets. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, as though it held no end, no beginning, just an eternal, suffocating silence. I had heard the rumors, of course, the stories passed down by the locals. The ones about the old trail in the woods, the one that no one ever dared to walk after dark. They said that if you strayed too far off the path, you'd never find your way back. That someone would make sure of it. But I didn't believe in such things. I had always prided myself on being a skeptic. I didn't put much stock in ghost stories or legends. The world was a place of logic and reason, not of shadows and superstition. So when my friends dared me to take a walk on the old trail, I accepted without hesitation. There was no harm in it, I thought. A little midnight hike to prove that the stories were nothing but that, stories. I started down the path, the crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. The forest closed in around me, the trees whispering softly as the wind stirred the branches. But there was something off about the air, the stillness. It felt like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. My skin prickled with unease, but I ignored it. I was just being foolish. There was nothing here. At least that's what I kept telling myself. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the path became harder to follow. The trees grew closer together, their trunks gnarled and twisted, as if they had been there for centuries. The underbrush thickened, and the air grew heavier, as though it was soaked in some ancient, lingering presence. But I pressed on, my steps steady, determined not to let the stories spook me. The deeper I went, the more I felt the strange weight of the forest pressing in on me. The sound of my breathing seemed to grow louder, more oppressive, as if the woods themselves were listening. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me, but there was nothing, only the darkness. I continued walking, my mind racing. Had I taken a wrong turn somewhere? The path was becoming more indistinct, fading away into the thick shadows of the trees. I paused, my breath coming in short bursts. I had been walking for what felt like hours, but the forest seemed unchanged, unyielding. I reached down to check my phone, but the screen was blank. No signal. Of course, I had been so wrapped up in the thrill of the hike that I hadn't even considered how far I'd ventured from the town. But now, standing in the heart of the forest, it was clear that I was lost. I turned in a circle, trying to find any trace of the trail, but the trees were indistinguishable, the landscape a blur of shadows and twisted roots. There was no sign of the path I had followed. My mind raced as I tried to remember which direction I had come from, but it was all the same. The darkness was absolute, the silence suffocating. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my nerves. It wasn't the first time I had been lost in the woods. It wasn't the first time I had felt this way. I had been out here plenty of times before, but something about tonight was different. Something about tonight felt wrong. I decided to keep moving. Maybe I had just wandered too far off course. If I kept going in a straight line, I would find my way back eventually. I forced my legs to carry me forward, but the deeper I went, the more the feeling of being watched crept over me. It wasn't the usual feeling of unease. No, this was something different. It was as if the forest itself had become aware of me, its eyes hidden in the shadows, its breath quickening as I drew closer. I tried to shake off the sensation. It was nothing. The wind, the trees, just nature playing tricks on my mind. But then I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, as though something was walking just behind me, matching my pace. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to face whatever was following me, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What if it was just an animal? What if I was imagining things? And then the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. My breath caught in my throat as I strained my ears, trying to hear anything at all. But there was nothing. The world had gone quiet once more. My skin prickled with a sense of wrongness, and I found myself unable to move. My body was frozen, as if the forest had reached inside me and pressed its icy fingers against my bones. And then, a voice. It was barely a whisper, just a breath on the wind, but I heard it clear as day. Don't turn around. I didn't have to be told twice. I wasn't sure what was behind me, but I knew instinctively that it wasn't something I wanted to see. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I slowly began to back away, keeping my eyes trained on the ground ahead of me. I didn't know how I knew, but I knew the path I had been following was gone. The trees had shifted, the ground had changed, and I was no longer on a trail. I was lost, and I wasn't alone. I turned to run. The wind howled in my ears, the trees whipping past me as I sprinted through the woods, blindly crashing through the underbrush. My heart was pounding, my breath ragged, my mind consumed with the overwhelming need to escape. But the woods seemed to shift with every step I took. The trees loomed closer, the shadows growing deeper, as though the forest itself were closing in around me. And then I saw it, a flicker of light just ahead, a lantern, swaying gently in the breeze, its soft glow a beacon of hope. My heart surged as I ran toward it, relief flooding through my veins. Maybe someone was out here. Maybe I wasn't alone after all. But when I reached the light, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was no one there. The lantern swung gently, its light casting strange shadows on the ground. But there was no person, no figure standing nearby. I reached out, my hand trembling, and grasped the lantern. It was warm to the touch, but there was no fire inside it. Just an empty, glowing shell. And then I heard it, a voice, this time loud and clear, echoing through the trees. You shouldn't have come here. I dropped the lantern. The forest was silent again, but the weight of those words hung heavy in the air. I turned to run once more, but this time the forest seemed to move with me. The trees bent and twisted, the shadows reaching out to grasp me as I fled, my footsteps muffled by the thick, oppressive silence. I don't know how long I ran. Felt like hours, days, lifetimes. The path was gone. The trees were endless, and I couldn't escape. And then I heard it again. The voice. You're never leaving. I stopped, my chest heaving, my legs weak with exhaustion. I couldn't keep going. I couldn't escape. And just as the darkness closed in, I realized that I wasn't in the woods anymore. I was standing at the edge of the trail, the path before me clear. But I was no longer alone. I could feel it. The forest had claimed me. Story 16. I had never believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, hauntings, curses. None of it seemed real to me. The world was just a series of events, explanations, and coincidences. But that night, as I drove along that desolate, winding road, everything I thought I knew about reality began to unravel. It started innocently enough. I was on a road trip, the kind I took to clear my mind and escape the weight of everyday life. The drive had been long, and I was eager to find somewhere to rest before continuing on to my final destination. My GPS had been working fine up until that point, and I had no reason to doubt it now when it told me to take an unfamiliar turn onto a small, isolated road that seemed to lead into the woods. I figured it was just another shortcut. The road was narrow, surrounded by towering trees that blocked out most of the moonlight, making the drive feel more like a passage through a tunnel of shadows. As I continued, the silence of the forest pressed in around me, broken only by the hum of my engine and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. The town I was supposed to be passing through was still miles away, but the eerie stillness of the place made it seem much closer, as if it were watching me. I hadn't planned to stop in the town. I just needed a place to grab a cup of coffee and stretch my legs. But something about the place called to me. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and despite the signs of civilization I passed, faint streetlights flickering far off in the distance, there was a heaviness in the air that made me uneasy. Still, I pressed on. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I came across the town. It wasn't anything remarkable, just a small, old-fashioned place tucked away in the forest, as if it had been forgotten by time. The buildings were crumbling, and there was an air of decay about the place. The streets were empty, save for a few cars parked along the side. But what caught my attention was the absence of life. There were no people walking the streets, no sounds of activity coming from the buildings. It was as though the town had been abandoned. I pulled my car to the side of the road, unsure whether to get out or not. The place gave me a strange feeling, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Felt wrong, but I needed to stretch my legs, and I convinced myself it would be okay. Besides, there was something oddly compelling about the place. I got out of the car and stood on the sidewalk, my feet crunching on the gravel. The air smelled stale, as though it had been trapped here for years. I glanced around, taking in the dilapidated buildings and the overgrown lawns. There was a small diner nearby, its neon sign flickering intermittently. I made my way toward it, hoping to get something warm to drink. As I pushed open the door to the diner, the bell above it jingled faintly, but there was no response. The interior was dimly lit, the smell of old coffee and grease filling the air. The tables were all empty, the chairs pushed back as if people had left in a hurry. The counter, however, was manned by an older woman, her face pale and worn, her hands trembling as she wiped down the counter. She didn't look up when I entered, but I could feel her eyes on me, watching every move I made. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken in days. I nodded, taking a seat at the counter. "I was just passing through. Thought I'd stop for a coffee." The woman didn't say anything, but after a moment, she set a chipped mug in front of me, filled with lukewarm coffee. The liquid sloshed in the cup, the surface rippling like water disturbed by something unseen. I reached for it, but my hand stopped halfway. Something about the coffee seemed off, like it wasn't meant to be touched. But the woman's eyes were on me, urging me to drink it, her gaze intense and unblinking. I swallowed my discomfort and took a sip, trying not to gag at the bitter taste that lingered in my mouth. The coffee tasted like it had been sitting for hours, maybe even days, but I didn't want to offend her. I forced myself to drink it, all the while feeling the weight of the woman's stare. "You're new here," she said after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. You shouldn't be, she added, her tone shifting. People who come here, they don't leave. Not like they came. I set the cup down, the words chilling me to the bone. What do you mean? The woman leaned closer, her face just inches from mine. This town, it isn't like other places. It's not on any map. People who come here, they never truly leave. Their minds get trapped here. Their souls too. I laughed, trying to brush it off. That's a bit extreme, don't you think? She didn't smile. It's the truth. And now that you've come here, you'll understand. Soon enough. Her words felt like a curse, a weight pressing down on me. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. I'm sorry, but I don't have time for this. I need to get going. The woman's eyes didn't leave me as I hurried out of the diner. The air outside felt colder now, as if the night itself had deepened. I made my way back to my car, but as I reached it, I froze. The town was different. The streets were no longer empty. Figures stood in the windows of the buildings, their faces obscured by shadows. Their eyes, however, were unmistakable, hollow, dark, watching me with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. And when I turned to look down the street, the town seemed to stretch on endlessly, the buildings fading into a fog that I hadn't noticed before. I started my car and slammed the door shut, my hands trembling as I turned the key. The engine roared to life, but the road ahead of me was different. It was no longer the narrow, winding path I had driven on earlier. It was an endless stretch of asphalt, looping back on itself, twisting and bending in ways that didn't make sense. I sped up, my heart racing. But no matter how fast I went, the town was still there, just ahead of me. The figures in the windows followed me, their eyes never leaving me. My pulse thudded in my ears as I turned the wheel, desperate to find a way out. But the road kept looping, the town kept reappearing, and the figures kept watching. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. I was back on the main road, the town nowhere in sight. The figures, the diner, the eerie silence, they were gone. My car was on a well-lit highway, and the GPS was working again. I could hear the hum of my engine, the usual sounds of the road. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that I had left something behind in that town, and that it was waiting for me out there in the dark.